Hey everybody. I just hit the record button. We're letting people on the call for our October extension hot topics. Today we've got Brian MacGowan. He'll be talking about landscape pests. As always, feel free to throw questions in the chat box. And as we're letting people in, I am putting our demographics poll up. If you guys could answer that as we're kind of waiting for folks to jump on, that's greatly appreciated. Um, what else? Questions? We do ask everyone to mute, and don't worry, this is all being recorded for those who are master gardeners. Make sure you count this as educational time. As always, this is a program for not just extension educators, but anyone who is interested in a topic at the time. So today with the landscape pests, I know we've got quite a bit of interest on that. But yeah, the whole point of this is to just kind of get some different perspectives and learn a few more things. So Brian, we'll give it about a minute. And again, if you guys could answer that demographic poll, and then the floor will be yours. And before I forget, so this month is landscape pests. And then next month is a real fun one. We're going to have Miranda Purcell. She is in charge of grapes on campus. So that'll be for November. And then for December, we've got the spotted lanternfly. So a lot of good topics with that. If you guys have a minute and you want to throw any ideas that you have for future topics, throw them in the chat box. We are doing our scheduling for the season 3, which is at the start of 2024. We have most of those speakers lined up, but we are going to continue this workshop into the future with all the good participation. So make sure you throw some ideas in or email myself or one of the educators who work with it. And we take those very seriously. So, all right, it is 12:01. Looks like the people coming in have kind of slowed down. Brian, I think you're good to share your screen, and I'll let you kind of do your introduction and take it away.
Awesome. Yep. Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate that. So it's good to be with you virtually today. So I'm kind of go a little more broadly today than just landscape pests. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the areas that I work in and about myself, but I'm going to spend most of the time kind of talking about some human wildlife issues that we can kind of some of us in the field can kind of see coming in our crystal ball. And certainly, I'm happy to answer any wildlife pest related questions that you all have from that standpoint. So I'm actually from South Bend. I went to school at Ohio State and then also at Purdue, but I've been in this position since January of '99. And so in my department, I'm one of the longer tenured folks from that regard. But in my line of work, and really anywhere in wildlife extension, a lot of us do work in animal damage. That's kind of historically been a niche that we work in. But I also do things with education, evaluation, as well as forest wildlife management. So that's a picture of me sitting next to a timber rattlesnake. That's about as close as I was willing to get to it there. So for many years, I worked with rattlesnakes and box turtles as part of the hardwood ecosystem experiment as a researcher, but also doing extension work from there. But certainly, I do a lot of extension in the area of human wildlife conflicts. So in terms of kind of the program, there's different things that we want to stress, right, from that standpoint. So this group is often termed prevention and control. And really, ideally, we would like to do more prevention than control, right? And so a lot of us, it's just human nature. And certainly I fall into this where I'm not necessarily actively preventing some of these things. I'm more of a reaction kind of a person where if there's an issue, then I'm going to react to it, right? And certainly methods that you use are going to be more effective if you from the preventative standpoint. And if you do have a problem, because nothing is 100%, they're generally more easy to deal with from that standpoint. But in that realm, really, so some of it is really kind of determining what the problem is. And so sometimes that is a real problem and sometimes it's a perceived problem, right? And so a lot of folks don't really understand, wildlife. And so they see a coyote or something along those lines and they get concerned, like, is there an issue there? The other part to that is understanding what methods work or usually work. That's a really important thing. And so certainly determining the problem and the animal that's causing the issue is really important to understanding what would work, right? And so you got to really match those things up because animal behaviors and things are quite different. And so understanding that is really, really important. And then the other part to that is understanding methods that don't work. And so some of these can really be quite unsafe, and it could be traps that are misused. So, for example, in fur bear trapping, they use sometimes we use body grip traps, which are kill traps. And so I've seen those used or misused, I should say, in suburban areas. And you can use them there, but there's a way to do it, and there's a certain skill about it. And so, issues with non-targets can certainly be a part of that. But also, things like repellents, it usually comes down to. So I still get questions about mothballs and, if I should use them, putting around plants that you plant and those kinds of things. And certainly, you always read and follow the labels on those things because if it was labeled for that use, and so if it was safe and effective, it would be labeled. And so only use things that are labeled for their use and really follow the label. It's really important. We get that. We beat that drum in extension quite a bit, but there's a reason why. It's a really critical thing. Professional advice. So in my field, I work a lot with wildlife services and the DNR, more from a policy and educational standpoint, but also nuisance wildlife control operators. So in Indiana, we have a group of people, companies that do this kind of work professionally for a fee. They have to take a test and pay a fee to get a license by the state to do that. And the DNR does have a website that's got information on how you can find those folks in your county and the types of work that they do. And then best practices, health and safety. I talked a little bit about the propellants. That also falls under health kind of issues, but also really with handling and moving wildlife. And so there's a ways to go about that, and there's things that you should really avoid, right? So people, veterinarians, wildlife biologists, nuisance wildlife control operators, trappers, those people that deal with live animals on a regular basis are really kind of the high risk group when it comes to zoonotic diseases and things like that. So it's always something to be cautious of. And then finally, rules and laws, right? So wildlife are regulated, especially migratory birds. There's a federal layer to that. And so understanding what the current law is really key to kind of keeping yourself out of trouble. And then the last thing is mixed into all that are personal choices, right? And so, what is a problem for me may or may not necessarily be a problem for one of you, right? So we all have different action thresholds. We all have different skills and resources available to us. And so those things are always kind of important. One thing that kind of falls under that category is whether you should kill a trapped animal that's causing issues, or you should relocate it somewhere else. And so we can talk about what the law says and that kind of a thing, but your decision to do that is really your choice, right? So for some people, they might find killing animals distasteful and they don't want to do it, and for others, not so much. But the key to that is not only understanding the law, but also what these animals are capable of after you let them go, and what can happen to them, that kind of a thing, both from a continuing the damage part of it, but then also survival and well-being of those animals. All those things are kind of part of the picture. So just, one of the things that Jessica asked me to do is kind of talk a little bit about, questions and things that I get. And certainly regarding questions, it really covers a very, very broad variety of things in terms of issues with livestock, with domestic animals, with crops, with gardens, with lawns, with structures, lots of things going on in terms of damage. And so I actually look through my files. And so when I get an email on something, I actually put it in a question file, and I put my answer in there as well. And so sometimes I'll use those to write articles and things like that. But it's also kind of nice to kind of review the year. I'll do that as well and kind of look through those. So I just did that in preparation for this. And these were things that came up within the last, year or two that I thought were kind of interesting from that standpoint. Some of them obviously very common, some of them, not so much. Most people might be surprised about issues with bald eagles. So that's one thing that bald eagles have really rebounded dramatically in the Midwest. And so they're actually becoming a pest in some areas in terms of not only the fish, but there's also been a couple cases of human attacks, defending their nests, that kind of a thing. So hard to believe we're there, but that's kind of where we're at with them. Another thing is with really health and safety concerns. And so there are numerous diseases that wildlife can carry that can be transmitted to not only people, but also domestic animals and livestock. And so that's always a big part of it from that standpoint. In terms of people, a lot of it is really kind of common sense. But again, the some of the information out there is either not well organized or just there's misinformation out there. So these are some of the questions that I've received. If you've got a patio and you're attracting birds there and you've got some feeders but there's droppings around, are there the concerns about, this person was immunocompromised, so they had concern like, should I, do this, or if I clean up the fecal material, what's the best way to go about that? So scraping up the loose things, wearing gloves, cleaning with the bleach solution, the railing and furniture and things like that is the way to deal with that. And there's actually guidance on that. With the horses, there was actually a case where a landowner had many horses and they had some deaths of foals. And so the disease diagnostic lab actually determined that the death of one was caused by salmonella. So they were concerned about mixing, geese that were there. So goose, groups of geese can consume a lot of food, but then they also they poop a lot, to put it bluntly. And so there could be salmonella and other things in their fecal material. And so there was concern if that was the mode of transmission. So in this large area, can they keep out geese? And so, but maybe there's opportunities to do some lethal control and things like that, because these people's horses were dying and they're really concerned about that. So that's obviously a pretty important kind of a thing. Bird flu risk to people, they hear about bird flu and the highly pathogenic bird flu, and they're concerned like, so I've got birds around, is that going to be a problem? Or I've got raccoons around and they've heard like this disease, raccoon roundworm, should I be concerned about that? So these are kinds of things that just recently that I've had to kind of answer and work with folks on. So where we get our questions and where you can provide us questions, certainly, is our nature blog. And so on our Purdue FNR Extension website, we have a blog. And so some of these blogs, we announce events and things like that, or their stories, but a lot of them are actually stem from that Ask the Expert page. And so let me see if I can figure this out here. All right, here. Okay, so if you click on that Got Nature, one of the things that comes down as a menu thing would be Ask the Expert. And so then this page comes up where you put some information in there and type up the question. That actually goes to Diana Evans, who's our extension information coordinator, as well as our web person. And so she'll, based on the topic area of that question, she'll send it to different specialists in the department and everything. So I get a lot of questions from her. Many of them are like ID things or things like that, and some of them are kind of humorous in a way. Just to give you kind of example, this was one from I think this was September. Someone sent this picture and was concerned that maybe the turtles were fighting with each other because they didn't think it was mating season. Well, the truth of the matter is box turtles mate throughout spring, summer, and even into fall. And so that was clearly the case there. So some of these are kind of entertaining from that story. I get a lot of questions about squirrels. And so years ago, Dr. Harmon Weeks, or Mickey Weeks, some of you may know him. He was a wildlife professor in our department. And we co-authored an article on, I think it was one of our first blog articles, maybe when we got that, on hairless squirrels. And so a lot of people see this and they think it's mange, which mange is caused by microscopic mites. And so those mites get into the skin and under the skin layer, and they cause a reaction where you get a lot of crusting of the skin and hair loss. But in this case, you can see this squirrel here has just general hair loss. That skin is in really, really good condition. And so the dark is the underfur. This is a fox squirrel. And so and then close farther down on the sides and the belly, you still have those guard hairs there. And so this is actually probably caused by a fungal issue. And so in some conditions, environmental conditions, like we often see these really peak when we have wet years in the fall. And so you get some molding on some of the corn. They consume that, and that issue, sometimes that seems to be attributed to skin fungal disease in squirrels. So this picture here obviously is during the growing season, right? The grass is relatively green there. I can't remember the date on this specifically. Of course, there are leaves there, so maybe this was last fall. Sorry about that. I don't know the exact date on that. But certainly if this condition happened during the wintertime, you can see that this could cause a survival issue for squirrels. But in most cases, they'll get over the disease and they'll kind of pop back and they'll be okay from that standpoint. A lot of times we'll get pictures and questions about, they see something, they take a picture of it, and they're like, what the devil is this? Most people would look at that and think it has to be some kind of a large animal, making something like that. And this is actually not the biggest one I've seen. I've seen them several times bigger than this. This is actually caused by European starlings. This is a nest. And the size of a starling, but if there's a gap in any kind of a large structure, usually you see these in the attics of barns and pole barns and things like that. And they just keep building a nest until it kind of reaches that entry point. And so that's all done by European starling. Kind of hard to imagine, but that's what that is. Some of the questions, though, we get are from educators. So we have county educators, obviously, in every county in Indiana. And so they'll often get questions from folks in their areas and just kind of want to know kind of how to do that. And so sometimes it's one of us, sometimes it's several of us. And so this past year, someone had an issue with fish disappearing from their ponds. And when I'm talking fish, I'm talking maybe 20 to 30 fish were gone. And so they were trying to figure out what was going on. And she thought it was river otter, and I would agree with that. And so, understanding what river otter do and what they're capable of is important to that. But really, the sign is important. So river otter use latrine sites. And so raccoons and river otter are two species that do that. They'll defecate in the same area over and over again. So you'll see piles of fecal material, and they'll have fish scales in there, and which aren't digested by the otter. And you'll see these of different ages, multiple piles of different ages scattered around. So that's really clearly otter sign. In the wintertime, you can get good tracks, snow tracks, and they'll slide down the bank towards the water. That's another good sign. And then they make these mounds. And so otters make scent mounds where they'll use scent glands on their body, and they'll mark these. And so it's a way for otters to communicate territoriality and things like that. And so understanding those signs and everything is really important to help determine what goes on there. So predation identification is definitely obviously an important kind of a thing, and they were really concerned about it. Sometimes we get questions submitted to us on Facebook or Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. And so we're fortunate to have a couple folks in our department who are really, really good about that. And so we're really active on both of those social media platforms. And so that's a good way to interact and kind of a fun way. So this just actually happened, I think it was actually this week, where someone had this trail cam photo and they had an animal here, and they're asking Purdue Extension and IFWA to help identify it. Well, so that was sent to me, and I think they thought it might have been a bobcat or a cougar or something like that, but it was actually a house cat. The picture's kind of small and poor quality. I tried to find the original one, but I think maybe he deleted the post because he was embarrassed about it. Said his friend was kind of giving him heck over that, but that's kind of a funny thing. But a lot of times people with cameras like that, they get pick up things all the time on their cameras, and that's the way the DNR actually and a lot of state agencies document things. And so I think it's been paused, but for a while, Indiana had a trail cam program where people can register with the state and turn those pictures in. And it's a good way to really determine distribution of species, like where animals spend time on a large scale. But then also you can pick up some very rare species and things, and from that standpoint, which you wouldn't be able to in other ways. And so trail camels are really effective for that. But of course, sometimes they cause some questions as well. The last part, I really want to kind of look towards the future, and these are some issues that are occurring now and probably will continue to get worse as far as that goes. Backyard free-ranging poultry is definitely one of them. And so there's a lot of folks now who have small flocks in their yard, and they use it for egg production. Some of them probably for meat, but I think most of them are for layers. And it's really kind of a valuable thing, but it can cause a lot of problems, right? And so one of them is predation. So chickens are relatively small, and there's a lot of things from weasels and mink to larger predators and obviously birds of prey that can feed on them. Snakes aren't necessarily going to feed on chickens, but some snakes will consume eggs. So sometimes that's an issue. Skunk and possum are more egg specialists as well, so they can that could be an issue as well. But you look at the symptoms in terms of the crime scene, and so there's kind of a way to go about it. Ohio State Extension actually has a pretty good publication on this, and I've seen some recorded webinars from University of Kentucky as well on this very subject. But it can be pretty dramatic. You see some dead poultry there, and you're kind of trying to figure out what the heck happened. But understanding kind of the signs of it, if that animal's kind of partially pulled through the fence, a lot of times that would be raccoons that do that, and sometimes they're working in there's multiple coons where one animal's kind of trying to get in the fence one area, so the animals go up against the other side of the pen and to get away from them, and then they're right by the fence, and like the raccoons try and pull them through and feed on them that way. This is a classic mink kind of a depredation event on this chicken, and mink for whatever reason they just don't kill one and consume it. They'll kill one, feed on a little bit of matter, of blood, and then they'll go kill another. So in one night, a mink can kill 20, 30 chickens relatively easy. So it can be really dramatic from that standpoint. And so that's certainly a part of it. Also, another part of this is the issue with highly pathogenic avian flu. And so it's more of an issue probably in the north central part of the country, in Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, those areas. But it's really an issue everywhere potentially, especially with when migration is going through. So waterfowl, things like ducks and geese, those kinds of things are carriers of it. Some of our raptors are as well. And then some of the corvids, the ravens, the vultures, and crows can be an issue. And so the issue here is that not so much with people. Really, the CDC looks at the disease risk very, very low to people from that standpoint of any of these flus. And there's no cases of this really going into people here, but certainly from a poultry standpoint. So commercial producers are really concerned about that, as well as backyard producers. And so the idea here is you don't want to mix the wild birds with the domestic birds. And in a commercial facility where much of it's going to be indoors, that kind of a thing, that's generally not a big issue. But if you have a backyard flock or a free ranging flock, it's going to obviously be much more of an issue. So that's something to consider. And usually the way we do that is a preventative thing. So we're either doing fencing, netting, those kinds of things to exclude animals from entering that area. And obviously that would be restricted to relatively small areas. But things like grids and other kind of scare devices could be applied to larger areas. Some of these may be more effective for some species than others. For example, if you had a grid system, some animals can simply walk under, right? So not every predator is just going to fly down and do that. And certainly not all these birds are predators, right? And so some of these waterfowl, they may enter an area from, if it's not fenced in, they can simply just walk into an area, especially if there's water and that kind of things in there. So those are kind of the ways we address that. But really kind of a tough thing to address unless you've got a pretty small area you're trying to protect. I mentioned vultures, black vultures in particular. So black vultures and turkey vultures are both native species. They're New World vultures. The difference is that black vultures seem to behave a little more aggressively. And so there's concerns there about predation on newborn calves and even birthing cows. And so what it's been documented a couple times that basically once the cow has their young, the calf's there, the vultures go in there, pick off the afterbirth, they pick out their eyes, consume those, consume the tongue, and then they feed around the perineum. They'll try and slash the flesh of these animals, but they're not really very strong in terms of their bite strength. So those soft tissues areas are really what they affect. There's been some research recently looking at how real this kind of phenomena is and how you determine depredation by black vultures in terms of being the cause of death versus something else killing it, and then the vultures simply go in and feed on it, right? So those are two very, very different things. So it's definitely a concern for some farmers. They're definitely expanding their range, although they really don't know why. Years ago in Indiana, they're only found kind of really along the bluffs along the Ohio River, but now they're really quite common in the southern part of the state, and then you find them even up into Michigan, some of those areas as well. So, kind of one of those things to keep an eye on. But there are things that we can do about it. The other thing that vultures do is, for whatever reason, black vultures are really attracted to rubber type things. And so on cars, like any of the rubber trim, windshield wipers, around a windshield, you'll have that rubber seal that goes around it. Those are things that they will pull off and damage. And while they're doing that, they'll sometimes defecate, and their digestive system is really acidic. And so if that stuff isn't cleaned right off immediately off the car, you're going to have some serious paint damage. So they can easily cause thousands of dollars of damage to vehicles from that standpoint. They've been seen to damage the roof liner. So on a flat roof, you've got that rubber liner, and then you've got gravel, and then there's drains in there and everything. They'll get up on those roofs, and they'll really hit those rubber liners and damage them. Obviously, if you get a big storm after that, you're going to have some serious issues. So kind of interesting, but yet again, if you're got that damage, it's not so much interesting as it is annoying and expensive. So what do we do? You can't haze vultures. Vultures are migratory birds. They fall in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as almost every species of bird that we have from that standpoint. So, but you can't haze them and harass them as long as you're not injuring the bird or causing nest abandonment. But the other thing you can do is use effigies. And so Kentucky's actually got a really nice publication on how to use effigies, and it's got a pattern in there and directions where you take basically a livestock, a 3x4 mat, and then you cut it up, and you use zip ties to kind of make the body. You paint the head and the tips of the wings to make it kind of look more like a vulture. And you basically hang these things upside down, about 15 foot or so high in the air, in very, very visible area. So for example, if you've got a roost by, or you're concerned about depredation to calves, farmers can hang that sucker up right around when the time they're having calves. So it's one of those things that's kind of interesting. The other thing that they're doing, though, is they have lethal control. And so migratory birds, there's a lot of paperwork involved with lethal control, and you have to show you've done certain things up to that point, hazing and other kinds of things. And if that's ineffective, you can apply for that. So Farm Bureau has done something pretty interesting, is they've kind of basically started the sub-permit program for their members. And so basically, if there's a website, you fill out this form, and if you're approved for lethal control, there's limitations and things like that. You'll get that permit, and you can do that, and then you can actually use some of those dead vultures that you shoot as effigies, and so that's allowable under this permit as well. So it's kind of a turnkey program, and one way to try and go beyond that barrier of going through the permit system with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I suspect this might serve as a model down the road for other ways. We can work together with some of these organizations to make it easier for folks to address their wildlife concerns.
Hey, Brian, we do have one question here.
Absolutely.
So the question is are vultures and buzzards the same? Then they also kind of follow this up. And do they kill the live animal and not just feed off the dead one that they found?
Yeah, so really there's no such thing as a buzzard here. All we have are vultures. And so people call them buzzards, but it is the same animal. Turkey vultures have a little red on them. They've got more light color in their wings, and so they're pretty easy to tell the difference that way. But in terms of the killing, that's the key, right? So I mentioned that study, and some of this work was done at Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center by Grant Burcham, Lee Humberg, Pat Zollner in our department. He's a wildlife professor. And so they also, basically what they determined was almost all the suspected depredation events that in their study, save for one, it was disease issue, is poor herd management, things like that killed the calf. It wasn't from the black vultures, but they have been documented to actually kill those animals, because like you'll get a flock of 5, 10, 30, and they're just all on them. They're very aggressive. The cow sometimes tries to prevent that from happening, but they can only do so much. And in a few cases, they actually have damaged the cow enough where they have to put the cow down. So in other words, right after birth, they're feeding on that perineum area, between their genitalia and their anus. That's soft enough tissue, and they'll expand in there and damage that animal to the extent where they have to put it down. So it's definitely, again, those things are rare, but when they do occur, it's obviously at a great cost to the farmer, and it's certainly unpleasant, to say the least. So this is one that you may saw on the list of what's the problem with hawks, probably killing, animals and things like that. Certainly hawks kill a lot of animals. That's kind of their role in nature. That's what predators do, and it's part of the system that we have, right? But there's actually an increase in red-shouldered hawks throughout not only Indiana, but other parts of the country. And again, why that is, they really don't know per se from that standpoint. But the thing about red-shouldered hawks that are different from some of our other hawks is they really aggressively defend their nest. So if they're nesting close to a house, or they're nesting in a park where there's a trail, people go by, go in and out of the structure, they think you're attacking their nest, and they're going to come down and defend it. And so you can imagine they've got sharp talons and things like that, so they can cut your head and cause some issues there. And again, this is a migratory bird. You're not going to get a depredation permit for hawks. The Fish and Wildlife is just not going to do that. And so, at least up to this point. And so basically all you can do is wear a construction hat in these areas that you're doing it. Some people will use umbrellas and things like that, but they'll just shred those up pretty quick because, again, their talons are really sharp. So it's just one of those things where it's like it's really more common. And again, historically in Indiana, these things really didn't have a wide distribution. They really weren't found in suburban areas, but that's really changed now. You really have not only red-shouldered hawks, but then also red-tailed hawks and even great horned owls that seem to have really adapted their behavior, after we've kind of changed the landscape and really occupied some of these suburban areas a lot more than they used to.
Hey, Brian.
Yes, sir.
So we had two questions that are somewhat similar. One is it legal to move the eggs to try and remove vultures from an area? But then another question was concerning wild animals. If they are abandoned or injured, what are sort of the human to animal interactions? What's appropriate and what's not?
Okay, yeah, both really good questions. So in regards with the eggs, and so with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and this was enacted in 1918, and around that time we had a lot of abuses and things with wildlife, and so we had a lot of declines of some of these species and a lot of birds, right? So birds were consumed for food, feathers were used for in fashion and things like that. And harvest at that time was really done from an efficiency standpoint, and they were really concerned about sustainability because at that time it was viewed like, well, once we clean out this, we'll just go on to the next place. So because of that, the law is pretty strict, and it really limits possessing or taking parts of birds, the birds themselves, just feathers. If you find a feather, it's technically illegal to hold that, as well as a nest. And of course, eggs are included under there. So by law, you really can't move or possess eggs of these species, right? The only exception to that is under special circumstances. And so, for example, with Canada geese, you can actually destroy the nest while they're constructing it, and then you can apply for a expedited permit to do nest destruction, where you make the eggs inviable. And that's because those things have gotten to such a problem in terms of wildlife, human wildlife conflicts. They've kind of expedited the permitting system and what's allowable, because it's overwhelming if they had to deal with those using the standard permitting system. So vultures, again, they'll nest sometimes in logs in other areas, and so you're probably not going to find a nest anyways. But and the issue with the vultures is if you have a roost and you have a roost close by, and so some of the management with black vultures is trying to disperse that roost. And so to do that, you actually basically go from a half hour before sunset to a half hour after sunrise, and you're doing noisemakers, horns, all sorts of stuff, trying to really disperse that roost and get them to leave and move on. Another management technique would be to cut down potential roost trees, right? So that's another thing that we can do. Remind me what the second question was.
In terms of finding an injured animal or
Yeah. So most of the time that you encounter an animal, this always happens with white-tailed deer. You see a little fawn or something like that. Mom's around, but she's just not there because you're there, that kind of a thing. And so that's a lot of these things. If you just leave them go, they're fine. From an injured standpoint, your best bet is to find a licensed animal wildlife rehabilitator. So on the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife website, you can look up licensed nuisance wildlife control operators that deal with wildlife damage, but then they've also got a search thing that you can look up licensed wildlife rehabilitators. And so different people will deal with different species. Not all of them deal with birds because, again, that's a whole federal permitting system that some of them just don't have the time or don't want to deal with. So that would be the best thing. And you may talk to them and say, look, I don't have the time, I can't do it. Or they may say you're too far away, you'll have to call somebody else, that kind of thing. So sometimes you get those barriers with it. It's certainly not a perfect system, but that's what we have. So I mentioned I had black bears on the list there. And again, we used to not have them. And ever since 2015, we've had them observed in Indiana almost every year. And so numbers in Ohio have certainly increased in recent years. This sightings used to be just in the darker blue and not in those counties. And again, some of these sightings may not even be Ohio bears. Some of them might be Kentucky bears. One of our bears that we had spotted in Indiana that spent a few months here was actually a bear that was tagged from Missouri. And so most of these bears that we have in Indiana like this are most likely young males. And so one of the things that wildlife populations do is they have dispersal. So mom and dad have the babies grow up, and just like people, they get to be 18 or whatever, graduate from college, and you kick them out. And so they have to go find their own thing. And so the males tend to go quite longer distance and sometimes hundreds and hundreds of miles. And again, if you think about it, it's probably an adaptation to kind of mixing up the gene pool, that kind of a thing. And so you'll get those kinds of thing. But some people think that in sometime in the future, we may very well have a breeding population of bears, a resident population of bears to some extent, most likely in southern Indiana, where it's a more forested region from that standpoint. So it's just something to kind of keep an eye on. And I just found this out recently where one of the bears that like a couple years ago from the fur bear biologist, Jerry Ann Albers, she said that it actually fed at 8 different sites where they had honeybee hives. And so they knocked over the hives and ate all the honey and all the other stuff in there. So did it 8 times throughout its kind of journey throughout Indiana. So that's something to think about. So, when we have a new species like this, there's probably things that we didn't really think about in terms of prevention methods that we're going to have to do. So either electric fence kind of things, which for bears isn't a great thing because they have such thick fur, but more likely, elevating some of these things on platforms where they can't get to them. So it's just kind of interesting from that standpoint. And then lastly,
hey, Brian, real quick
yes,
before you leave the bears here,
absolutely.
Do you think black bears will be more routinely in southern Indiana area over the next 10 years? So basically, do you think we'll see more of them in the southern Indiana over the next 10 years?
I think that's a reasonable theory, right? So when you look at our proximity to bears, okay, southern Indiana is right here. So we're pretty close to this part of Kentucky and this part of Ohio. So a bear can easily walk, that way. I remember like in Cincinnati, that one right there was a bear along the highway spotted. People were kind of freaking out, that kind of thing. But again, people live with these things all the time, right? So it's just an understanding of what they do and how we can kind of live together. There's actually a national website called bearwise.org that kind of has a lot of good information about how we can cohabitate with bears and things that you can do if bears are in the area, that kind of a thing. So coyote. So this is something that I get questions about quite often, and it'll probably never cease to end because, quite frankly, we'll always have coyotes around. Once they're there, you really can't get rid of them. You can't relocate them. You can trap them and kind of reduce the population, lower it, but you'll never lower to any extent where you'll get rid of them. So certainly when people see coyotes, they're concerned, and so they're worried about attacks. And so dog breeds are obviously, dogs are one thing that they're concerned about. So if you've got a small dog and you've got a backyard and you know you have coyotes in the area, it's probably not a good idea to leave them out there, especially during the breeding season when coyotes are really more territorial. So end of January, February are times where some of these attacks on dogs seem to happen. And again, canines are competitors, right? So wolves don't like coyotes. They'll get them out of their area. Coyotes don't like foxes. They'll get them out of their area. And certainly coyotes aren't fans of dogs. They'll think that they're a competitor. And so they'll kill them and try and, reduce competition for resources. That's what they do. And so that's obviously a concern. I know where I live, I have two kind of packs of coyotes, one to the west and one to the east southeast. And so when I'm walking my dog, I can hear them, that kind of thing. And so they're around in a lot of places. And certainly this is a possibility, but it's something that as long as you are mindful of it and use good practices, you'll be fine there. The other thing obviously is people. And so there's a paper studied in 2009 that summarized all the attacks in the United States and Canada. Most of these were predatory, but a lot of them were really influenced by not only rabies and other diseases, but then also human feeding animals. And so that's always a big thing when we live with coyotes, is to really avoid feeding them intentionally or unintentionally, right? And so a lot of problems come by that from that standpoint. You'll notice Indiana isn't on that list. I had Jerry Ann Albers write an article about coyotes in the Woodland Steward a year or two ago. And a reader responded, well, that's not true. The DNR is lying to us because there was an attack at Crane, and it's been well documented, that kind of stuff. And so I actually gave that to her. And so she had no record of that. She contacted Crane, and they actually looked up in the local paper there. And so that in 2002, a jogger was nipped on the leg by a coyote while they were jogging. So they think it was more of a curiosity thing. And it was the only time that's happened there. There's coyotes all over the place on Crane and a lot of people going around. So it was just kind of interesting from that standpoint. So that wasn't in the record. So there actually has been one documented attack in Indiana, and certainly in recent years from that standpoint. So, but again, very, very low risk. Okay. They're around and for the most part, they do fine. So in terms of what they eat a lot of rodents. And so voles, mice, things like that, certainly. They don't really consume rats. Nothing seems to eat rats for whatever reason. But this is a difference between what they're supposed to eat and what people are feeding them. So this is the context of two trapped coyotes. This one's a nuisance coyote, and someone was feeding it like Chinese leftovers, right? So the bamboo, chicken and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of neat. So intentionally feeding coyotes is really, really bad. People see animals outside and they feel sorry for them. They want to do something to help them and feeding them. Outside of bird feeders, which can be attracted to other species, we really don't recommend feeding animals. That's a no-no. So what do they eat really? Voles, depending on, there's a lot of different diet studies. And so the amount of these animal groups really depends on where it was done and the timing of it, right? And so voles is really strongly, very commonly, the number one food item in their diets, really followed by rabbits, and in some studies, it's actually white-tailed deer fawns. House cats are 0 to 23%, so they actually do eat cats. So I guess, coyotes are good because outdoor cats are really bad for wildlife. So that could be a good thing. They also eat a lot of plant material. So especially in the fall, this time of year, we have a lot of fruit left on shrubs and things like that. They consume a lot of insects and plants and things like that. So just kind of interesting. The thing I stress about coyotes is a lot of these things, right? So predation is a natural kind of a thing. A lot of things need it to kind of keep their populations in check, right? So it's really important. And there's actually been some research done that they can limit growth of urban Canada geese, which by themselves can be an issue. They can reduce deer populations and slow growth, but they're not really going to eliminate deer just on their own from that standpoint. And again, they are really avid rodent consumers, and there's some thought they actually help limit groundhog and other mesopredators. So foxes would be one of those, right? But then also with raccoons and skunks as well. So it's just kind of neat from that standpoint. I mentioned all that because it's a lot of times, like how these animals fit in within these systems, we really don't give a lot of thought. We're just focused on, I have an issue or I might have an issue. What do I do about it? That kind of a thing. And so sometimes it's good to kind of take a step back and see the whole picture. Okay, so that's really all I have. And so I know Jeff mentioned landscape kind of pests and things like that. We've got time here. I'm happy to answer questions about that if folks have questions regarding things I didn't discuss as well.
Well, the question that we got was keeping the deer away from hostas. Is there anything you can do?
Yeah, if you're talking like yards and that kind of thing. So hostas, obviously, tulips, there's things that are definitely kind of high on the preference list for deer, and that's certainly one of them. I find that taste repellents work pretty effectively with that. The key with taste repellents, though, is what works for me in my area may not necessarily work for you, because there's all sorts of things that go on, right? So the landscape's different around us. I might have more deer or less deer than you. The amount of food that is available and the types of food is going to be different in different areas. And so that all plays into effect on that. Plus, there's going to be individual variations in animals, right? Some people like really spicy food, other people don't. It's the same thing with animals, surely. But taste repellents. So I would recommend, starting small. Maybe buying some RTU ready to use products where you can go out and spray them. If you have a lot of hostas that you're wanting to protect, you might have to get something that's more of a concentrate that you add water to, and concentrates can be in a liquid or a powder form. If you do use those, really read the label, because some of those will recommend something that's an anti-foaming agent or a vapor guard, that kind of a thing, to really kind of help with the mixing of it. If it recommends those things, really do it, because otherwise it makes mixing it kind of a mess and much more challenging, that kind of a deal. So it really depends on that, and see what works. And once you find something that works, go ahead and use it. The other thing is you're going to have to reapply. So you have to be vigilant, because once those hostas are growing, they're one of the first green things, at least around here they are. And so really hitting those plants when they're first developing is important. And then after that, periodically, some people will say, every month kind of a thing is a good rule of thumb from that standpoint. But I generally find around my home is the plants that are closer to the home, as opposed on the back part of the yard where there's woods and things, I'm much more successful keeping animals off of them using that approach.
And kind of on that vein, so we get a lot of raised beds around too. Is that kind of the same thing with vermin and other pests coming through with the vegetables?
So raised beds of vegetable crops?
Yes, yeah.
So with vegetables, though, you're not going to apply repellents with something you're consuming, right? So you're really limited to fences, exclusionary devices, those kinds of things. Some people will put up have like old rags that they'll cut up in strips, or an old sheet, and they'll soak those in some type of a repellent that's got an odor, taste kind of a thing to it, and they'll put those out. I'm not so sure that's really effective, but it's not too hard to do. And some people, that's attractive to some folks. But really with raised beds, if you're asking me, moving them closer to a home might help. Again, it might help, but it won't guarantee it. If you really want to guarantee wildlife not eating something, excluding them is really the only thing you can do.
Gotcha.
So another question that just came in here. Someone is seeing more chipmunks in their yard. Are there any ideas on the cause of this, and what are some possible control ways to control them?
Yeah, where chipmunks can be an issue, that they're rodents, and incisors grow throughout their life. So they'll chew on stuff. They'll chew on the edges of porches, steps, downspouts. They're good at all sorts of stuff. They do feed on seeds and plants and things like that, but mostly seeds. But their burrowing can cause issues in terms of concrete cracking and that kind of foundational issues, where if you have a large burrow system next to your house, you have a lot of rain, it can actually cause issues with water in your basement. So with chipmunks, there's really no toxicants or repellents labeled for them. Basically, you're left with the option of trapping. And so if you want to trap and remove and relocate, or trap and kill, Just keep in mind the law is if you relocate it, you have to have permission from the property manager if it's a public property, or owner if it's a private property. Yeah. And there's a lot of ways people trap chipmunks. Some people use small box traps. Some people will use rat traps. Others will use kind of a specialty body grip traps over their burrow holes, that kind of a thing. So if folks, I always point to folks to like wildlife control supplies. They have a lot of specialty traps and things for wildlife damage. But I mean, there's other things, but that's probably the biggest source, the most diverse source in terms of those kinds of things as well.
So you've mentioned traps a couple different times, and I guess personal question for me is, what type of trap is a humane trap versus an inhumane trap? What can describe the difference between the two?
So that's a really good question. So we actually do have a publication on using box traps to trap wildlife, and so we go into capture myopathy in that, and we talk about this issue. And so any type of a trap, even people think of a cage trap or a box trap as a humane trap. Anytime you set a trap, there is a risk of an animal dying or being injured as a result of setting that trap. So from that standpoint, so your definition of what humane is might differ from mine or Jeff's, and that kind of thing. So kind of keep that in mind. But really comes down to the species. And so some things, for example, with tree squirrels, they just don't take to box traps very well. They're have high motors, especially like those little pine trees or pine squirrels, little red squirrels. And when we trap those, for example, up at summer camp in the UP, Michigan, we have to be really careful, really quiet, really deliberate with dealing with these. Otherwise, they'll simply just die. And so there was actually a study done with tree squirrels. It was a while ago, but they were looking at survival and how they do when you relocate them. So if you take a squirrel that's causing damage and you relocate it somewhere, what happens to it? Almost in that study, almost all the squirrels died or moved away. And so some things just don't handle that. So just kind of, I don't really have a good answer to that. So it's just, I think it comes down to that category of personal choice. From that standpoint, but certainly if you set a trap, you are taking on a responsibility to check that trap frequently. Indiana has a 24-hour trap check law. If you're trapping in conditions that are very hot or very cold, extreme conditions, then you might want to increase that to twice or three times a day if it's a live trap, especially if it's not designed to kill the animal.
Brian, there was a question too that was sent in via email, just about work you've done with timber rattlesnakes. Maybe touch on some of those ecologically, what they can do or what they provide.
Sure. Yeah. So that was part of the hardwood ecosystem experiment. So that study was looking at a number of different communities or species of wildlife, as well as beetles, moths, plant communities, all that kind of thing. And it was really centered around the theme of how we manage our forests in terms of harvesting timber, prescribed fire. And so my focus was on, one of them was on timber rattlesnakes, where it's a state species of conservation concern. So the Division of Forestry wanted to know kind of what was happening with those in relative to harvesting. And so we've located rattlesnakes and tracked them and looked how their spatial kind of use was before harvesting, then how that may or may not have changed after harvesting. And basically the take home message was it really didn't affect them at all. It's probably a benefit because you actually had increase in some of their prey, particularly chipmunks, when you had a lot more of this down woody material in these openings. And so it was kind of interesting from that standpoint. But with that project, the question I always get is like, well, why are we even doing this? I mean, it's a snake, right? So it's not like, we've got other things to spend our money on. So the thing I'll reference that is there's actually been a lot of research done in the last 15 to 20 years with rattlesnakes and a lot of venomous snakes, copperheads included, in terms of their venom. And so their venom is really a complex cocktail of different types of compounds. And those compounds act very specifically on certain cellular processes. And so they're very interested in looking at them in terms of cancer treatment, treating heart attacks and strokes. And so there's actually been some drugs developed from that technology that deals with all those things. Because if you think about cancer, for example, right now with chemotherapy, that treatment, obviously you're targeting those cancer cells, but it also affects all your healthy cells too. It's a very, very hard process. And the idea with being able to specifically have something that only targets the cancer cells is very highly desirable. And so that was really the focus of some of that work from that standpoint. But in terms of the money we spent on the project too, I mean, most of our money was spent on technicians. And so labor is expensive, and we had a lot of folks on this project. And the skills that they learned doing that really benefited them in terms of going to graduate school or doing their career, right? So we're doing telemetry, we're doing plant sampling, all that kind of stuff. And you can do that same things with birds, with deer, with whales, all that kind of stuff, right? So just think about the tools and the methods that we're giving them the experience more from that standpoint than just simply the snake itself.
Thank you. Any more questions out there? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Yeah, there is one more question here. So Lois asks, our resident mother deer tend to drop babies next to the house. We see that deer returning to where they were dropped. Any suggestions on how to deal with this?
I assume she's maybe concerned about damage or something like that, or
It sounds like maybe keeping the deer away from the house, or not coming back to where, not close to the house. So,
well, I'm not sure there's really much you can do outside of having a fence, an 8-foot fence around your property where the deer can't jump it and go back there, right? So, I mean, that's the thing with repellents. Repellents are really designed to prevent an animal from consuming something. So you can have repellents out there, but it doesn't mean the deer aren't going to go through your property or hang out by your house. Maybe there's the cover right by the house is very desirable. Oh, okay. So damage from the hostas. Yeah. So in terms of preventing the animal from being there outside of a fence, no, is the short answer. Yep.
All right, so I'm going to stop the recording. For everyone who's still on, we'll be sending our